Ever get that feeling like there's this kind of silent auction going on whenever you open up that Uber app?
Oh, yeah. I know what you mean.
Like something's setting the price, but you don't know what.
Right, like an invisible hand or something.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. The fascinating world of Uber's dynamic pricing algorithm.
It's a wild ride.
It is. We've got this article here called City Transportation Commander, Deciphering Uber's Dynamic Pricing Algorithm. Yeah. And let me tell you, it's a lot more complex than just surge pricing.
Oh, definitely.
So whether you're an Uber pro or just curious about all the tech that's kind of shaping our world, well, this deep dive is for you.
For sure.
All right, so think back for a sec to those days before Uber existed.
Oh, man, I remember those days.
Trying to hail a cab on a busy street corner.
It's pouring rain and everyone needs a ride.
The number of cabs, totally fixed.
Yep. And the
But
prices.
also fixed.
That's kind of frustrating.
Right, so that's where Uber came in and kind of flipped the script with their whole dynamic pricing system.
Exactly. And I think that's where their real innovation was.
Yeah, it's not just about connecting riders and drivers through an app. It's about using data to adjust prices constantly.
And that keeps things moving even when demand goes crazy.
For sure. Now, of course, dynamic pricing itself isn't anything new.
Nope, it's been around forever.
Think about like a lemonade stand on a scorching hot day. It might charge a little more because everyone's thirsty, right?
Makes sense, supply and demand.
But what makes Uber's approach so unique?
Well, it's the sheer scale of it and the speed.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, imagine trying to adjust lemonade prices for an entire city all at once
Yeah.
and in real time based on how many people are thirsty and where they are
Why?
and how many lemonade stands are actually open.
That's a pretty good analogy.
That's essentially what Uber's algorithms are doing.
So let's say it's Friday night. A big concert's just let out, and everybody's scrambling to get an Uber.
Happens all the time.
How does that algorithm kick into gear?
Well, first, it sees that demand is just spiking way more ride requests than usual. Then it checks how many drivers are actually nearby.
Okay.
And if there aren't enough boom surge, pricing kicks in.
Prices go up.
Exactly. And suddenly it becomes a lot more appealing for drivers to head towards that concert venue.
Interesting. So it's almost like this digital dance between supply and demand, with the algorithm acting as the choreographer.
I like that analogy.
Keeps things balanced.
And it never stops the algorithms constantly monitoring and adjusting those prices.
All right, so that's the basic idea.
Yeah.
But what's really going on behind the scenes? Like, what kind of data is this algorithm crunching to make those split-second decisions?
Well, think of it this way. Get that dance right. The algorithm needs to know the city like the back of its hand.
Oh, yeah.
So it's always looking at road networks, traffic patterns, even things like upcoming events and the weather forecast.
Gotcha. So if it knows there's a big football game about to end, it can basically anticipate a surge in demand, even before those ride requests start pouring in.
Precisely. And it's not just about where people are, it's about when they need those rides. Think about it. Trying to get an Uber at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning?
Yeah, way harder.
Gonna be a lot harder than, say, 2 p.m. on a Tuesday.
For sure.
That's what we call temporal data. It's all about understanding how demand changes over time.
Okay, makes sense. But I bet it goes even deeper than that, right? Doesn't it look at things like my past Uber habits, too?
You got it. The algorithm also considers things like individual user behavior, things like your ride history, how often you cancel, what types of rides you usually request. All of that helps kind of paint a picture of your needs and preferences.
So it's like building a profile on you,
Kind of.
trying to predict when and where you're most likely to need a ride.
Exactly. And of course, it's also looking at the driver's side of the equation, too. Things like their acceptance rates, preferred hours, and typical driving areas.
Wow, so it's like this massive puzzle with all these pieces of data fitting together to create a real-time snapshot of what the city needs for transportation.
That's one way to put it.
But how does it actually make sense of all this information?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. We're talking complex mathematical models and machine learning all coming into play.
Ooh, now you're speaking my language. Tell me more about this math wizardry.
All right, so imagine a toolbox filled with all sorts of different mathematical tools, each one designed to analyze a different type of data.
Okay, I'm awesome.
So there's something called time series analysis, and that's all about spotting trends over time, kind of like figuring out if Uber rides generally get more expensive as the night goes on.
Oh, interesting. So that tool helps the algorithm predict future demand based on past patterns.
Exactly.
What other tools are in this mathematical toolbox?
Well, there's spatial statistics, which focuses on understanding patterns across different locations. Think of it like this. The algorithm can use this tool to figure out which neighborhoods tend to have the highest demand on Friday nights.
Okay, so it's like a digital map highlighting all the hotspots for Uber rides
Exactly.
in real time.
And then we've also got game theory, which is all about understanding how different players, in this case riders and drivers, might make decisions based on the current situation and prices.
So if the algorithm knows that riders are more likely to choose a cheaper ride, even if it means waiting a bit longer, it can kind of nudge the prices accordingly to try and encourage drivers to accept those requests.
Exactly. It's like a game of chess where both the rider and the driver are trying to make the best move.
Oh, I like that.
The rider wants the cheapest ride, the driver wants to make the most money, and the algorithm is like the chessboard trying to predict those moves and set a price that works for both.
That's a really cool way to think about it. But it's not just about predicting the future, right? You mentioned something about the algorithm actually learning from its mistakes.
Oh, absolutely. That's where reinforcement learning comes in. It's like teaching a dog a new trick. The algorithm tries different pricing strategies, sees what works best to balance supply and demand, and then learns from those experiences to get better over time.
So it's constantly experimenting and refining its approach based on what it learns.
Precisely.
Hmm.
It's like having a whole team of data scientists working around the clock to make sure that pricing strategy is the best it can be.
That's pretty impressive. Okay, so we've talked about all the tools in the algorithm's toolbox, but can you give me a real-world example of how all of this comes together?
Sure. Let's say it's a Tuesday afternoon in Manhattan, usually a pretty quiet time for Uber. But the algorithm sees that rain is forecasted to start in about an hour. And there are several Broadway shows letting out soon, plus fewer drivers than usual in Midtown,
Oh, so we've got a recipe for a surge brewing.
potentially.
But how does the algorithm deal with those kind of conflicting factors? The typical low demand of a Tuesday afternoon versus the rush of theatergoers and people trying to escape the rain.
Right, well, that's where the algorithm's predictive power comes in. It might look at historical data and see that Tuesdays after 5 p.m. often see a spike in demand when people leave work and factor in that additional demand from the theater crowds and all the rain avoiders.
Yeah. Okay, so it's anticipating a gradual increase in demand over the next couple of hours. What does it do with that information?
That's where it gets strategic. It might decide to preemptively adjust prices, maybe a slight surge multiplier of like 1.2x, just enough to encourage more drivers to head towards Midtown and maybe even curb some early demand.
So it's like the algorithm's playing chess, thinking a few moves ahead,
Yeah.
trying to anticipate that demand and avoid those crazy price spikes we sometimes see.
Exactly. It's all about proactive balancing.
So we've seen how this algorithm juggles all that data and makes these decisions in real time. But it's not just about keeping the Ubers running smoothly, is it?
No way. There's a much bigger picture here.
There's got to be some wider impact.
Yeah, dynamic pricing has really changed the way we get around, but it's also sparked a lot of debate about how it affects cities and society as a whole.
For sure.
All right.
Let's start with the good stuff. We talked about how surge pricing can encourage more drivers to get out there when things get busy, which seems like a win for everyone.
Definitely. More drivers on the road means more people can get rides.
Exactly.
And by making those rides a bit pricier during those really busy times, the algorithm kind of nudges people who aren't in a rush to maybe hold off a bit, helps smooth out the demand, and keeps the system from getting totally overloaded.
So it's kind of like a pressure valve, right?
So that's a great way to put it.
Releasing some of that pent-up demand before it explodes into surge pricing chaos.
Exactly. And here's another benefit. Even when prices are higher, surge pricing, make sure that people who absolutely need a ride right then and there, like in an emergency, they can still get one.
Right, because even if some folks are willing to wait it out, there are always going to be situations where a ride is super important.
Exactly. Dynamic pricing really prioritizes those urgent needs, even if it means a higher cost.
Okay, so we've got increased supply, more balanced demand,
Yeah.
and reliable service even during those peak times. Sounds pretty good so far. But I know there are some criticisms of dynamic pricing too. What are some of the main concerns people have raised?
Well, one of the biggest ones is fairness. Critics argue that surge pricing can really hit low-income riders the hardest because they might not have the flexibility to wait for those prices to go down.
Right, not everyone can just rearrange their schedule or hang around for a cheaper ride.
Exactly. It raises questions about whether the system, while efficient, could actually make the gap bigger between those who can afford to pay for convenience and those who can't.
So it might make things more efficient overall, but it could come at the cost of fairness for some riders.
That's the trade-off. Another concern is transparency. The algorithm is often seen as this mysterious black box, making it hard for both riders and regulators to really understand how those prices are being set.
Yeah, I get that feeling. You
Right.
open the app and see a crazy high price, and you're just like, how on earth did they come up with that number?
Right, and that lack of transparency can make people suspicious. If they don't understand how the algorithm works, they might assume the worst. Like that Uber's manipulating prices just to make more money.
It definitely feels like you're just trusting this invisible force to do the right thing.
It is a bit of a leap of faith. And that lack of understanding can also lead to worries about price gouging, especially in emergencies.
Right. We've seen situations where prices have skyrocketed during natural disasters or other crises, which raises some ethical questions about whether the system is taking advantage of vulnerable people.
It's a tough issue with no easy answers. On the one hand, you want to make sure drivers are willing to provide service in dangerous conditions. But on the other hand, it doesn't feel right to potentially profit from someone's misfortune.
It's a hard balance to strike, for sure.
Now, to be fair to Uber, they have made some changes to try and address these concerns.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for one, they've put price caps in place for certain extreme situations to prevent those really insane price spikes we've seen in the past.
So there's a limit to how high the surge can go, even when demand is off the charts.
Exactly. They've also tried to be more transparent by explaining surge pricing more clearly to users and showing what factors are causing those prices to go up.
So giving riders a better idea of what's behind those fluctuating numbers?
Exactly. And they've partnered with some cities to offer subsidized rides for low-income riders in certain situations.
So trying to make the system a bit more accessible for those who might not be able to afford those higher prices.
Right. But even with those efforts, the debate about the ethics and social impact of dynamic pricing is far from settled. As algorithms like this become more common in other parts of our lives, these questions are only going to get more important.
Okay, so we've dug into how Uber's dynamic pricing works. The good, the bad, and the complicated. It's clearly a powerful system, but one that raises a lot of questions. But what about the future? Where do you see dynamic pricing going in the years to come?
Well, I think it's safe to say it's not going away anytime soon. And if anything, it's going to become even more sophisticated. We're already seeing this push towards personalized pricing.
Personalized pricing.
Right.
What does that look like in the world of Uber?
Imagine opening the app, and instead of just seeing one price, you see a few different options. Maybe there's a standard fare, a slightly higher fare for a guaranteed ride within 5 minutes, or a cheaper fare if you're willing to wait 15 minutes.
So kind of like how airlines have different fare classes.
Mm.
Some people are willing to pay more for flexibility, while others just want the cheapest seat.
Exactly. It gives riders more choices and lets them pick the option that works best for their needs and budget.
That actually sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
It takes away that feeling of the algorithm is in control and gives you more power as a rider.
And as cities get smarter and more connected, those algorithms could tap into even more data. Imagine real-time info from traffic lights, parking sensors, public transportation schedules, even social media trends.
Wow, that's a ton of data. What could they do with all that?
Well, it could make demand predictions even more accurate, optimize those ride routes, and even suggest other ways to get around, like taking the bus or subway if it's faster or cheaper. We might even see dynamic pricing integrated with those other modes of transportation.
So instead of just telling me how much an Uber will cost, it could tell me if the bus is a better option.
Look, exactly. It's about making the whole transportation system work better.
That's a pretty awesome vision of what transportation could look like. Yeah. But there's one more thing we haven't talked about yet. Self-driving cars. How do you think dynamic pricing will adapt as those become more common?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Will we see algorithms negotiating prices with autonomous vehicles in real time,
Wow.
creating this totally free market for transportation? Or will those self-driving cars still use the same dynamic pricing models as human drivers?
It's wild to think about how those two technologies might come together and all the new challenges and opportunities they could create.
Definitely something to think about. But as exciting as all of this is, we can't forget about the downsides.
Right. We talked about those concerns around fairness, transparency, and the potential for price gouging. Do you think those issues will get even worse as dynamic pricing gets more complex and more widespread?
It's definitely a risk. As these algorithms become more powerful and more ingrained in our lives, we need to be really careful to make sure they're used responsibly and ethically.
So it's not just about making these systems smarter and more efficient. It's about making sure they actually serve humanity and not the other way around. It's kind of like we're at the edge of this whole new world of transportation, where algorithms are making all the decisions.
Mhm.
It's exciting and a little scary all at the same time.
I agree. It's like the wild west of algorithms out there. And remember, this is just the start. We've been talking about Uber, but dynamic pricing is already popping up in other areas too, like energy, healthcare, even education.
Oh, hold on. Dynamic pricing for electricity and healthcare. What would that even look like?
Well, imagine your electricity bill changing throughout the day based on how much power the whole grid is using, peak demand during a heat wave.
Prices skyrocket.
You got it. Or solar panels pumping out extra power on a sunny afternoon.
Prices plummet.
Exactly. It's like the stock market, but for your energy bill.
But isn't that kind of risky? What if people can't afford to use their AC when prices are super high?
That's one of the big concerns for sure. Supporters say these real-time price changes could help people use energy more wisely and ultimately lower consumption overall. But yeah, there are definitely worries about people being able to afford it, especially those who are already struggling.
I can see how the same logic could apply to healthcare, too. Imagine the cost of seeing a doctor changing based on how many other people are trying to get appointments.
Right. It could mean shorter wait times for urgent cases, since those higher prices might discourage people who don't need immediate care. And in theory, it could encourage more doctors to work during peak times, which could actually make healthcare more accessible for everyone.
But doesn't that just create a system where the rich get faster access to doctors? It feels like it could make things even more unequal.
That's the big ethical question here. How do we balance the benefits of a data-driven system with the need to make sure everyone can get essential services, no matter how much money they make?
It's like we're trying to walk this tightrope between progress and fairness.
Exactly. And it's not always clear which way to go.
It all comes back to this idea that algorithms are just tools,
Tools that can be incredibly powerful.
but it's up to us to decide how we use them and what kind of world we want to create with them.
We have to demand transparency, accountability, and fairness from these systems. We have to make sure they're working for us, not the other way around.
Well said. This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's amazing how much these invisible forces are shaping our lives.
It's been a great conversation. And remember, the more we understand about these systems, the better prepared we'll be to navigate all the changes that are coming.
So keep asking those tough questions and exploring these new frontiers of tech. And join us next time for another deep dive into the world where technology and humanity collide.
Until then, keep those Uber apps open and those minds engaged.